I believe to be a good pedagogue when it comes to teaching. For those of you who may be unaware of what pedagogy is, it is the method and practice of teaching, especially as an academic subject or theoretical subject. Throughout this seminar, I'll be exploring my pedagogical approach to teaching, comparing it with that of a current teacher, as well as comparing it with theorists from over time. Pedagogy is not a simple concept to get one's head around, and it has to be remembered that there's no right or wrong when it comes to pedagogy. People have different views and implement these views differently into the classroom. Pedagogy has definitely evolved over time, and it's important to understand why that may have occurred. When talking about pedagogy, it's a very moral and political subject. For one's pedagogy to be shown in the classroom, it will depend on their morals, and these morals may change over time, meaning that their pedagogy can evolve over time. It is now time to introduce our special guest for today's session, so can we all please welcome Joshua Simmons.
Thank you, Caitlin. Great to be here.
Maybe before we begin, you could give us a little background about your teaching.
Sure. I've been teaching 15 years now and I'm currently a grade 1 teacher, and I've been for the past 4 years. Before that, I've taught prep, grade 3 and grade 5.
Great, thanks for that. I don't know about you, Joshua, but when I first decided I wanted to become a teacher, I had no idea how complex it would be and how much thought goes into it. Even today, I still hear of people who think that teaching is easy and that teachers only need to know as much as their primary age students. What would you say to these people who have this view on teaching?
I don't think this could be any further from the truth if I was being honest. Not only do you have the responsibility of 20 or so young children on your shoulders, the planning involved is also very time consuming.
I thought that might be the case. Did you know that the average teacher makes 1,500 decisions a day? Granted that they may be small, but they all matter. All these decisions impact some way on your students. It is important to have planned and to know your students well enough in order to make the right decisions. I found this quote that I'm going to show you guys. It was really interesting and I wanted to share it with you today. So I believe that what this quote is saying is that children learn best when they're able to create links with what they're learning, rather than just having the teacher sitting there and giving them the answers. This relates to what Hinchey described as the constructivist approach. So how do you incorporate Hinchey's approach into your classroom, Joshua?
Well, Hinchey talked about the fact that the focus is on the students learning rather than the teacher's instructions, as well as the fact that students draw on previous knowledge and make meaning to new information. So when I am teaching, I try to incorporate many things that we have already learnt and help the students to create links. Within my classroom, there is a lot of class discussion and working together. I try to avoid having the children sitting on the floor and me just giving them instructions. I like to have input from my students.
That sounds like you really relate with what Hinchey was saying. Is there anyone else that you have found that you relate to in terms of the constructivist approach?
Yes, I found that Thompson's idea of the virtual school bag was very relatable.
Yes. Just in case our viewers are unaware, Thompson came up with the idea that he called the virtual school bag. He described this to be the fact that children come to school with previous knowledge and that they'll learn best if the new information can be linked to this previous knowledge. How do you incorporate this into your classroom, Joshua?
Well, I think that these two concepts really overlap. So like I said with Hinchey's theory, I try to incorporate the new learning with what the students already know. I know that Thompson is talking more about previous knowledge and things children bring from outside the school environment. So at the beginning of each year, I have the children bring in a small bag of things that think they best describe them, and we all sit in a circle and take it in turns to show our bags to the class. I also participate in this activity. This helps me to feel comfortable and feel as though they can be themselves in my classroom.
That's a great idea. I'm sure that many classroom teachers watching now are making note of that for the beginning of next year. If you don't mind, I'm just going to jump in here and tell our viewers about a personal experience of mine that I've seen within the classroom recently. I was observing a grade 1 classroom in which they were learning maths. It was an all-boys classroom and they had a very big focus on footy within their classroom. They had footy tipping going on, they had footy flags all around the room, and even some of them had footy-coloured lunchboxes. The teacher was aware of this, so during this maths lesson that I watched, he made the focus on footy. He used terminology such as goals and points, and the boys had to work out what number he was thinking of. So if you don't mind playing along with me, Joshua, I'll show the audience an example of how the teacher did this.
Yeah, of course.
I'm thinking of a number in my head. So let's start with one goal. We add a point, we times it by a goal, and then we minus a point. So what number do we have here?
34.
Exactly. So I thought this activity was a great example of how the teacher was using the boys' previous knowledge and interests to help them learn and make learning fun for them. So every time that I've been in a classroom, I've always found that the relationships you have with the students make a big difference on how they're going to perform throughout the year. I actually found a theorist called McDonald spoke about this. He said that students will connect with those who empower them. So how do you get to know your students, Joshua?
To me, knowing your students well does not just mean knowing their name, age, how many people in their family, and what sports they play. It is deeper than that. If you want to really know your students and allow them to get the most out of your classroom, you need to know what they value, even if they are not aware of it yet, the qualities that they bring into the classroom, their culture, and even their family backgrounds where possible.
Yeah, I think all those things is very important when getting to know the children. So in order to do as McDonald said and empower a child, you need to know all this information about them. If they feel comfortable with you and as though you care about them, then they're going to thrive inside your classroom. So Hattie and Anderman also believed that the relationship between the teacher and the students were important. They found that when teachers responded to students in ways that are responsive to the students' needs, emotionally warm, and provide for student autonomy, students tend to not only feel more motivated in the classroom, but they also achieve at higher rates. I observed a student who was quite shy and reserved when I was in the classroom not long ago. The student was an only child and struggled with making friends and fitting in at school. The teacher was aware of this and went out of her way to approach the child in a way that would make him feel comfortable. She was aware that the student would not thrive in an environment where he was constantly asked to talk in front of the class or anything like that, so this teacher was careful not to put this child within this situation. It was important that the child didn't feel pressured, and so because this child was shy, it was also important that the teacher tried to get him out of his shell a bit more. Rather than asking him to talk in front of the class and answer questions about a topic that he wasn't really familiar with yet, the teacher would sometimes get him to share his work after they completed it. This was a common practice within this classroom, so the child wasn't feeling as though he was being singled out, but he was getting great practice when it came to gaining confidence. I thought this was a great example of a strong relationship that the teacher had with this student, and the fact that he trusted her enough to have the confidence to talk in front of the class and know that that the teacher would not let him be humiliated. I noticed, Joshua, that you mentioned getting to know the student's background and culture before. How important is this to your teaching?
I believe that a student's culture is one of the most important things that you as a teacher need to cater for. Kinchelo also supported this idea. He talked about the fact that it is not enough to just have days where students' different cultures are celebrated. Rather, you need to implement them into everyday lessons and tie them into the curriculum rather than focusing purely on the dominant culture. Even things as simple as the look of the classroom can often be more suited to one culture. In order to empower your students, as McDonald mentioned, it is important to have all cultures represented.
Yeah, I agree. It's super important. I'm interested to know how you incorporate culture into your classroom without making it too overwhelming. So do you have different corners for different cultures, or is it a different way?
Not different corners as such. If you represent these cultures completely separately, this may lead to a separation between the students in your classroom, which is definitely not what you want. I try to incorporate culture in small things such as pictures on the wall or a calendar that includes all different cultures' holidays. When I think about my classroom, I imagine that all the cultures will be represented together rather than separately. As a classroom, you are together and a little family when you're at school. It is for this reason that I think it is important to remember to not separate any cultures when displaying them.
So you believe that whilst it's extremely important that you get to know your students' background and incorporate these into the curriculum, it is also important that these students see it around the classroom?
Correct.
When I was doing some research for this interview, I came across this quote that I found very interesting. Essentially what Dewey was saying is that we never stop learning. We don't get to a certain age and then never learn anything anymore. It's a never-ending process. So how do you interpret this quote, Joshua?
I agree with exactly what you've just said there, Caitlin. As a teacher, I think it is a very important thing to remember. You as a teacher do not have all the answers and know everything there is to know. You can learn of your students as well.
Yeah, I agree. So I don't know if you've heard of a person called Freire, but as hard as it is to believe, he essentially argued against this. He came up with the banking method, which enforced the fact that children are just receptors of information from the teacher. Basically, Freire believed that without the teacher, the children wouldn't learn anything.
I don't think that is true at all. Now, I'm not saying that having a teacher in the classroom is unnecessary. I just believe that the students bring a lot more to the classroom than what Freire has given them credit for. As I said before, when we were talking about Thompson's virtual school bag, students bring culture, knowledge, and experiences to the classroom that the teacher may not. As a teacher, I believe this is important to guide your students' learning rather than force information upon them.
Yeah. So, within your classroom, how do your students learn? Do they complete worksheets a lot, or do you come up with other ideas?
Whilst it used to be acceptable to give students worksheet after worksheet, I think as teaching has evolved, it has become increasingly important to create different environments and experiences for your students to learn in. It is inevitable that I will have to have some worksheets every now and then for my students, but I will try to incorporate a lot of group work and activities that allow the students to draw on knowledge that they already have.
So it's like what Killen talked about when he gave the ideas that teachers should give students the opportunity to think about what they're learning, and to build upon their background knowledge, they have to ensure that they connect new learning with the world beyond the classroom.
Correct. It has been proven that students learn best when they are able to relate to the information they are learning about. They need to connect it to what they already know and what they have an interest in. As a teacher, I think it is not only important to know your students, but to also know what they are interested in at that very moment.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've heard that that may even involve going to see children's movies or looking at certain crazes that are going on at the moment. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but if a teacher can relate what the students are learning at the time to, say, footy cards, for example, or the movie Frozen, or the newest toy that everybody wants, then there's a much higher chance that the students will remember the information.
Absolutely correct. As a teacher, it is not always about getting the facts across as quickly and efficiently as you can. You are working with children, and I think that if you want to be a great teacher, then you need to put in the time and effort.
Fantastic point. Just quickly before we run out of time, I'd like to talk to you about what working with your fellow teachers as part of a team is like. How important is this to you?
I think this is very important. As a teacher in a school, you're surrounded by many other professionals, and in order to become the best you can, it is important to bounce ideas off each other and share strategies that you find useful.
Yeah, a great point. I was recently a part of a professional learning team and found that whilst I may have come up with some good ideas, without the help of my team and working together, there's no way we could have come up with the amount of information that we did. Through bouncing ideas off each other, we were able to come up with a lot more information to share. Even having 4 of us in the group, there was still things that if we were to work together again, that we would do differently. We focused pretty heavily on the topic that we were looking at, but we didn't really focus on the flip side. I think it's important to remember that no one is perfect, and that if we work as part of a team when we're teaching, then we're going to get a lot closer to perfect than if we're alone. Well, Joshua, unfortunately we're out of time today, but thank you so much for making the time to come in and talk to us. I really appreciate it.
No worries at all. Thanks for having me.
I'm sure I speak on behalf of all of us in saying that you've given us a great insight into your pedagogy, and we can definitely learn a lot from you. So thanks again. So thanks everyone for joining us. We'll be back the same time next week. So thank you and good night.